When I was in West Africa, I observed that a large struggle of the countries is just to identify sectors where to grow. So countries like Benin, like Mali, like Burkina Faso, but last year I visited Nigeria, which is not a low-income country, but they are focusing on oil, and they know that oil will be finishing, and what to do then. And I would like to ask John Page a question. How can institutions like the Brookings Institution, or also your experience from World Bank, help these countries to identify growth poles, or however you might call it, to start focusing on and start education on, start infrastructure measures, etc.? Thank you.
Well, that's a huge question. So let me start with what they should stop doing. The World Bank should stop spending somewhere between $5 and $10 million a year on doing their famous doing business surveys. And countries should stop putting them on CNN to claim that they are now the fastest reformers. If you need one case in point, Tunisia and Egypt were ranked as world's fastest reformers by the World Bank over the last 5 years, and look what that got them. So, to put it in somewhat more academic ease, international financial institutions need to begin to come to grips with the fact that industrialization is a process that does require a strategic approach. This is not saying anything that Justin Lin probably didn't say last night. He and I agree on most of these things. But you'll find that he's rather a lone voice in a place like the World Bank. So that's what they should not do. What should you do? I think the first thing you should do is to begin by recognizing that fundamentally the world's industrial economy, and after all, in the end, poverty reduction is about creating good jobs. It can be good jobs in agriculture, it can be good jobs in industry, it can be good jobs in other high-valued activities, tourism, back office services, agro-processing, flowers. But the bottom line is that in Africa, in Latin America, and in the Middle East and North Africa, economies have created too few good jobs for the last 25 years. The places where poverty reduction has been the fastest, East Asia and South Asia, a substantially larger percentage of the workforce has moved into good jobs. While in Africa and Latin America, based on some recent research by Danny Roderick and Margaret McMillan, people have actually been moving out of the good job sector for the last 25 years. So you need an industrialization process to begin, an industrialization writ large, high value-added activities. What's changed about our understanding of that? I think three things. One, we understand the nature of global trade has changed in the sense that a term that economists like to use, trade in tasks, or a term that politicians like to use, offshoring, has become the new reality of international trade. The fact that production processes, especially in Asia, but not uniquely in Asia, are really broken down into a series of steps, and companies actually often locate those steps in different countries, manufacture in certain places, assemble in other places, and sell into third markets. Asian countries have mastered that. South Asian countries are mastering that. Africa has not come close to mastering trade and tasks. Paul Krugman, who won the Nobel Prize last year in economics, his sidekick Tony Venables and Fujita-san, all remind us that industries tend to cluster in places, mainly cities. So understanding agglomerations is important. How is it that you get an agglomeration going? And what are the productivity benefits of an agglomeration? And that gives you an additional problem, which is if you're not a country that has industry, it's hard to get industry going because industries like to locate where other industries exist. And then finally, something the business schools have brought to us, and it's very interesting, our colleague from Tata was talking about it without using the academic term, firm capabilities. The actual endowment of tacit knowledge, working practices, ways of doing business are very important. And we know that, again, firms will tend to want to locate where those capabilities exist, but also that foreign investors will bring those capabilities with them. So if you think about a world in which tasks are important, agglomerations are important, and capabilities are important, from the perspective of a low-income country, what can you do? You need a strategy. You need a strategy to acquire capabilities, which means having a foreign investment strategy. You need a strategy for where you're going to sell your product, which means you need an export strategy. And you need a strategy for how you're going to get people to want to locate in your country you're going to need a spatial industrial policy. Now, I happen to be a big fan of putting those together in at least one specific concrete small step, an export processing zone. What is really interesting is that I have now, in 3 years of research, including some sponsored by the Department for International Development and some by the World Bank, not been able to find a really well-functioning, world-class export processing zone anywhere in Africa south of the Sahara. That's not rocket science. The Chinese know how to do it. The Chinese are now sponsoring 6 export processing zones in Africa. It'll be very interesting to see what comes of those. But the problem is that I think, and this comes back to my rant about the World Bank and doing business, African policymakers have been distracted from the real issues of coming to grips with these kinds of underlying forces, precisely because they've been managing policies to please the World Bank and others. And I suspect our colleague from the Ethiopian ministry, I used to be on the other side of the table, I'm now liberated, I can say these things, would have a bunch of horror stories about this. But the point is, speaking to a group of people engaged in scholarly research, one, we need the research. I'm talking best on what I think is the best available research in these areas, but academic work is always full of controversy, and making these kinds of definitive statements is what people in a public policy place like Brookings can do that proper academics probably would shy away from. So we need more research. We need to understand these things much better. We need partnerships between industry and government to try to address some of these issues. And we need a way, with respect even for the Ethiopians who've shown how to do that very well in cut flowers, but haven't been very successful in other industries, to get government and business communicating with each other on these aspects, so that policy is both informed by what business knows and government understands how the policies are having an effect. So you don't need resources. Let me just leave you with this thought. In the 1950s, a highly paid mission of distinguished American economists went to East Asia. And they returned and they said, well, we're not quite sure what's going to happen in East Asia, but we are sure of one thing. There's one country out there which is just a basket case. It has no resources, it has a corrupt government, and it's going to be an impossible task to develop. That was, of course, the Republic of Korea. They also said, there is one country that is just like us, and therefore it's going to be a fantastic development success. And that was the Philippines. So 2 lessons from this. 1, you don't need resources to grow. And 2, never trust economists' predictions.
Thank you, John Page, for this insight.